Red Bluff didn't just ignore Hattie. Folks actively pitied her. In frontiers where women were scarce as July rain, a woman had to be deeply flawed to sit unchosen. Hattie was fat. She smelled of neat's foot oil and raw wool, breaking mustangs faster than any local cowboy. Gideon didn't want porcelain dolls. He wanted survival. When this mountain man walked from shadowy livery stalls leading 3 mules alongside his massive bride, onlookers considered it a joke. Folks guessed wrong. The mud in Red Bluff didn't dry. It just baked into uneven, ankle-breaking ruts that smelled faintly of pig iron and horse urine. Gideon stood at the edge of the boardwalk, the soles of his worn leather boots gripping the warped pine planks. He hated this town. He hated the noise, the clatter of the tin stamp mill upriver, the shouting of drunken miners, the buzzing of blue-bottle flies over the butcher's waste bin. Up on the ridge, silence was a physical thing. Here the air was crowded. He needed salt. He needed powder lead and coffee. Most importantly, he needed 3 good mules to pack his winter haul of pelts down the mountain come spring. He didn't need a wife. He walked toward the livery at the far end of the street. The sun was a pale, hot dime in a bleached sky. Sweat trickled down the back of Gideon's neck, stinging the collar of his buckskin coat. He didn't take the coat off. A man didn't shed his skin just because the lowlands were boiling. The livery was a cavern of shadow and ammonia. Dust motes swam in the shafts of light, punching through the gaps in the roof. From the back stall came the sharp, rhythmic crack of a hammer on iron, followed by a low, steady voice. Gideon walked down the center aisle, pausing at the stall. Inside, a woman was shoeing a terrified roan gelding. She wasn't small. She was by the harsh standards of the frontier massive. Her shoulders were broad, her hips wide beneath a heavy dust-caked denim skirt, and her arms bared to the elbow were thick with unhidden muscle and soft flesh. She had the gelding's hind leg pinned between her heavy thighs, her weight anchoring the animal down as it tried to dance away. "Quit your fussing," she murmured. Her voice wasn't sweet. It was gravel and river mud. "It's just a nail, you big baby. Stand." The horse rolled an eye, showing white, but it ceased its trembling. The woman drove the nail home, clipped the end, and rasped the hoof smooth in 3 efficient, brutal strokes. She dropped the leg and straightened up, wiping a forearm across her brow. Her face was flushed shiny with sweat. She had a broad nose and a hard jaw. She saw Gideon standing there. She didn't gasp or cover herself. She just picked up a rag from the stall door and wiped the grease from her calloused hands. "You looking to buy or just looking to block my light?" she asked. "Need mules," Gideon said. His voice cracked. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 4 months. He cleared his throat and spat a dark glob of tobacco juice into the dirt. 3, sturdy. Not the broken-down nags your brother sells to the greenhorns. Hattie's eyes narrowed. They were pale, washed-out blue like a winter sky. She knew who he was. Everyone knew Gideon. He was a ghost story the town told itself. He came down once a year, traded furs, and vanished into the high country where normal men froze to death. "Jeb's drunk," Hattie said, stepping out of the stall. She walked with a heavy, rolling gait, feeling the ache in her lower back. She was 28. She felt 50. "If you want mules, you deal with me, but they ain't cheap." "Show me," Gideon said. She led him to the rear corral. The sun hit them like a physical blow. Hattie didn't flinch. She pointed out 3 mules, 2 browns, and a slate gray. Gideon walked into the pen. He didn't check their teeth first. He checked their eyes, then ran a hand down their legs, feeling for heat in the joints. "The gray favors his left front," Gideon said, turning his head. "Only on pavement," Hattie countered instantly. "Take him on dirt, he's sound. He's got a thick wall on that hoof, needs trimming different. I do it myself. You put standard shoes on him, sure he'll limp. Leave him barefoot in the snow, he'll outpull the other 2 combined." Gideon paused. Most women he'd met in the settlements talked about ribbons, or the dust in the church house, or didn't talk at all, cowed by their husbands. This woman talked about hoof walls and traction. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was a dull, mousy brown, escaping in frizzy strands from a tight braid. Her blouse was strained across her heavy chest. She caught him looking. A familiar, dark defense mechanism shuttered over her eyes. She crossed her thick arms. $40 for the 3. She said, her tone suddenly biting. Take 'em or leave 'em, mountain man. I got stalls to muck. Gideon didn't care about her weight. He cared about the way she handled the roan. He cared about the fact that she didn't smell like cheap lavender water. She smelled like raw wool and hard work. Your brother. Gideon started slowly testing a thought that had just formed in the dark, practical corners of his mind. He the one leaving you to do all the heavy lifting while he drinks up the profits at the saloon? Hattie's jaw tightened. My brother owns this livery. I just work it. He ever plan on letting you own a piece? I'm a spinster. She said the word tasting like copper in her mouth. She hated saying it, but it was a fact like a broken spoke or a lame horse. Women like me don't own businesses in Red Bluff. We just die in the back rooms of them. Gideon rubbed his bearded jaw. The beard was coarse, graying at the edges. He was tired. The winters were getting longer. Last year he had broken 2 fingers in a trap, and had to set them himself with a piece of firewood and a leather strap. If he broke a leg this winter, he would die in his cabin, and the wolves would pull his bones through the floorboards. He needed a partner, not a lover, a workhorse. You want out of Red Bluff? Gideon asked. Hattie laughed. It was a harsh barking sound. Where am I going to go? I'm built like a rain barrel, mister. The mail order catalogues don't want me. The miners want saloon girls. I'm stuck here until I drop dead in the hayloft. Come up the mountain with me, Gideon said. The wind blew a dust devil across the corral. A horse snorted. Hattie stopped laughing. She looked at him, searching his weathered, leathery face for a joke. She found nothing but flat, cold seriousness. Excuse me, I need someone to manage the stock. I got 6 horses, and if I buy these 3 mules, I trap, I hunt. I ain't got time to tend the animals the way they need tending. You know horses. You ain't afraid of work. He paused, looking down at his dusty boots. I ain't looking for a romantic arrangement. I'm looking for a wife on paper. It keeps the town from talking. You get a cabin half my furs, and you never have to muck your brother's stalls again. Hattie felt a flush of heat rise in her thick neck. Part of her wanted to slap him, the sheer transactional audacity of it. I ain't looking for a romantic arrangement. She knew what that meant. I don't want to touch you. She looked at her hands. The knuckles were swollen. She thought of Jeb, who would stumble in tonight, demand the ledger, and yell at her for spending too much on oats. She thought of the 50 more years she might live confined to this dusty, ammonia-soaked prison. I eat a lot, she said softly, staring at the ground. It was her deepest shame, voiced into the open air. I shoot elk, Gideon replied evenly. Meat ain't a problem. Hattie looked up. Her pale eyes met his dark ones. I ain't climbing down from that mountain if I go up. I ain't asking you to. $50. Hattie said, her voice shaking slightly, but her chin jutting out. You pay Jeb $50. He'll think he's selling the mules and throwing me in for a laugh. But the paper we signed at the courthouse says I own half of whatever you got. Gideon reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. It clinked heavily. Deal, he said. The trail was steep, a brutal zigzag of loose shale and exposed pine roots. The air grew thinner with every hour, losing the baked metallic smell of the town and taking on the sharp, sterile scent of ozone and evergreen. Hattie rode the grey mule. Gideon rode a massive ugly bay horse leading the pack string. Hattie's inner thighs were screaming. She knew how to ride, but she hadn't been in a saddle for more than a quick jaunt in years. Her weight pressed heavily into the leather, the pommel digging into her stomach on the steep inclines. Sweat pooled beneath her heavy wool dress, trickling down her spine. The corset she had worn for the courthouse ceremony felt like a cage of iron bands crushing her ribs. She wanted to unlace it. She wanted to scream. She did neither. She set her jaw and focused on the mule's ears, reading its mood, shifting her bulk carefully to help the animal balance on the treacherous scree. Gideon rode ahead, silent. He hadn't spoken since they left the tree line of the foothills. He was acutely aware of the woman behind him. He expected the sounds of distress. He expected the whining, the heavy breathing, the demands to stop and rest. Every time he glanced back, ready to offer a grudging break, he saw her sitting heavy and square, her face pale, her jaw clamped shut. Stubborn, he thought. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the valley below, the temperature plummeted. It went from a comfortable autumn heat to a biting, bone-deep chill in the span of 30 minutes. "We camp here," Gideon called back, pulling the bay up into a small clearing sheltered by a massive outcropping of granite. Hattie didn't answer. She waited for her mule to stop completely before heavily dismounting. Her legs turned to water the moment her boots hit the earth. Her knees buckled, and she fell hard against the mule's shoulder, catching herself by grabbing a fistful of coarse mane. She hissed in pain. Gideon turned in the saddle, his hand resting on his rifle scabbard. He watched her recover, pushing herself upright, refusing to look at him. "You ain't used to altitude." Gideon said, his voice flat. He wasn't comforting her, he was stating a fact. "I'm fine." Hattie wheezed. She began unbuckling the mule's cinch with stiff, clumsy fingers. Gideon dismounted and walked over, slapping her hands away. "Leave it, I'll unpack." "I ain't a cripple." Hattie snapped, her voice rising in sudden defensive anger. She shoved her broad shoulder against his chest. It was like shoving a brick wall, but he took a step back in surprise. "I pull my weight. You bought a partner, remember? You tend the horses. I'll tend the mules." Gideon stared at her. In the fading light, her face was drawn, smudged with dirt and sweat. Her eyes were defiant. "Suit yourself." He grunted, turning away. For the next hour, the only sounds were the clinking of buckles, the soft tearing of grass, as the animals grazed on long tethers, and the snapping of dry wood. Hattie stripped the heavy packs off the mules, her muscles burning. She rubbed down the grey's legs, feeling for the heat she knew would be there. She found a flat rock, and sat heavily on it, her lungs burning in the thin air. Gideon built a small, smokeless fire out of dry squaw wood. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He just filled a dented tin pot from his canteen, threw in a handful of coarse coffee grounds, and set it on the coals. Next to it he placed a small cast-iron skillet, dropping in a lump of bear fat, and a thick slab of salted venison. The smell of the melting fat hit Hattie's stomach like a fist. She realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Gideon handed her a tin plate. The meat was tough, salty, and burned on the edges. To Hattie it tasted like salvation. She ate quickly, mechanically, chewing the tough fibers until her jaw ached. Gideon sat on a log opposite her, nursing a cup of black coffee. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the deep grooves around his mouth and the pale scar that slashed through his left eyebrow. "You handle a pack saddle better than most men," Gideon said quietly. The wind hissed through the pines above them. Hattie stopped chewing. She swallowed hard, washing the meat down with a gulp of bitter coffee. "My father bred draft horses before he died. Taught me how to balance a load. If the weight shifts, it rubs the spine. Rubs the spine, the animal goes lame. Animal goes lame, you walk." Sound logic. Silence stretched between them again. It wasn't entirely comfortable, but it lacked the prickly hostility of the town. Hattie looked down at her empty plate, tracing the scratches in the tin with a thick fingernail. "Why me?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Really? There were widows in Red Bluff. Women who wouldn't break the back of your mule. Women who look right." Gideon didn't look at her. He stared into the glowing orange coals of the fire. "I had a wife once," he said. The words seemed to require physical effort to push out of his throat. "A long time ago. Pretty thing. Thin as a willow switch. Brought her up here. First winter she got sick. The cold got into her chest and she just faded out, shrank to nothing. He took a slow sip of coffee. I ain't looking for pretty, Hattie. Pretty dies up here. I need something rooted to the ground. I need someone who won't blow away in the first gale. He didn't mean it as an insult, but the bluntness of his words stung her pride. She was a boulder to him, a heavy object to block the wind. Hattie set her plate on the rock beside her. I'm going to sleep, she said stiffly. She laid out her bedroll near the fire, struggling awkwardly to arrange her heavy limbs beneath the wool blankets. The ground was hard cold and unforgiving. She lay on her back, staring up at the canopy of black pine needles and the cold, diamond-hard stars beyond them. She listened to Gideon breathing on the other side of the fire. She was a married woman. She was lying on the side of a mountain with a man who had bought her like livestock. And yet for the first time in 10 years, no one was laughing at her. They reached the cabin on the evening of the third day. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress. Built of thick, unpeeled pine logs, chinked with mud and horsehair, it sat in a bowl-shaped valley, surrounded by towering granite peaks. A sturdy lean-to for the animals was attached to the leeward side, banked with earth to hold in the heat. When Gideon pushed the heavy plank door open, the smell hit Hattie instantly. It was a dense, masculine odor of old wood-smoke-dried blood, rendering fat and unwashed wool. The cabin was a single, large room. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a rope bed built into the corner completed the furnishings. It ain't much, Gideon said, striking a sulphur match and lighting an oil lantern on the table. It's a roof, Hattie replied. She didn't wait for permission. She dropped her small satchel, grabbed a corn broom from the corner, and began sweeping out the layer of dust, dead flies, and wood shavings that coated the floorboards. She needed to move. If she stopped, the sheer, crushing reality of her isolation would sink in. She was days away from civilization. If this man decided to murder her, no one would ever know. But Gideon didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a man who just wanted to take his boots off. Over the next week, they fell into a rhythm born of necessity rather than affection. Gideon repaired his traps, oiled his rifles, and chopped wood with a relentless mechanical energy. Hattie took over the cabin and the lean-to. She patched the chinking in the walls, scrubbed the heavy iron cookware until it shone black, and spent hours with the animals. She found comfort in the beasts. The horses didn't care about the size of her waist. They cared about the softness of her hands and the consistency of her voice. She quickly realized Gideon, for all his mountain knowledge, was heavy-handed with a bridle. He treated horses like machines. Hattie treated them like nervous children. The weather turned violently on a Tuesday in late October. The morning dawned the color of a bruised plum. The wind didn't howl. It shrieked, tearing through the valley with a physical force that made the log walls groan. By noon, the snow was falling so thickly that Hattie couldn't see the woodpile 10 feet from the door. Inside, the fire roared, eating through cordwood at an alarming rate. The cabin was warm, but the air felt thin and tense. Gideon paced. He was like a caged bear, constantly checking the heavy wooden shutters, peering through the cracks into the blinding white chaos. They're spooked, Hattie said, sitting at the table, mending a tear in Gideon's heavy wool shirt. Gideon paused mid-stride. Who? The horses? I can hear them stamping. Gideon listened. Beneath the roar of the wind, there was a dull, rhythmic thudding coming from the adjoining wall of the lean-to. It's just the wind. Gideon dismissed, turning back to the hearth. They're fine. I built that shelter to withstand a blizzard. It ain't the wind, Hattie said, setting her needle down. Her voice was firm, laced with absolute certainty. That's a panic trot. The bay is kicking the back wall. Something's out there. Gideon frowned. He walked over to the door, hesitating. To open it was to invite the blizzard inside. Wolves don't hunt in this shit. They hole up. Maybe it ain't a wolf. Maybe it's a cat. Or maybe the roof is giving way. I'm going out. She stood up, her heavy frame moving with surprising speed. She grabbed her thick wool coat from the peg and wrapped a scarf around her head. "Sit down," Gideon barked, stepping in front of the door. "You'll get blown away the second you step off the porch. Move, Gideon." Hattie's eyes flashed cold and hard. "Those animals are tied up. If they panic, they'll snap their own necks on the halters or kick each other to death. You might know how to shoot a bear, but you don't know shit about horse panic. Move." Gideon stared at her. She was a foot shorter than him, but she looked immovable. An immovable object in a wool coat. He stepped aside, grabbing his rifle and his own coat. "I'm right behind you." Hattie threw the latch and pulled the door inward. The storm hit them like a physical blow. The wind screamed into the cabin, bringing a blast of blinding, freezing white. Hattie shoved her way out onto the porch, putting her shoulder into the wind, forcing her heavy body forward. The snow was already knee-deep. She waded toward the lean-to, the cold biting through her heavy wool skirt in seconds. Gideon was a dark shape beside her, the rifle held awkwardly against his chest. She reached the heavy timber door of the lean-to and shoved it open, slipping inside. The smell of terrified horse was overwhelming, a sharp, acrid scent of sweat and fear manure. The darkness was absolute, save for the pale light filtering through the snow-drifted cracks. The bay horse was rearing its hooves, crashing against the timber wall, eyes rolling white. The mules were screaming, pulling back on their lead ropes, choking themselves. "Get a lantern!" Hattie yelled over the noise, pushing past Gideon. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the flying hooves that could easily crack her skull. She waded directly into the chaos. "Whoa, son! Whoa now!" She bellowed, her voice cutting through the panic with deep, resonating authority. She moved toward the massive bay. It reared again, its iron-shod hooves flashing inches from her face. Hattie didn't flinch. She lunged forward, using her own massive weight. She slammed her broad shoulder directly into the horse's chest, grabbing the halter with both hands and dragging its head down by sheer brute force. "I said stand!" she roared. The impact of her heavy body, combined with the absolute dominance in her voice, shocked the animal. The bay froze, trembling violently, its chest heaving. Hattie kept her weight pressed against him, wrapping her thick arms around his neck, burying her face in his coarse mane. She began to hum. It was a low vibrational sound deep in her chest. Gideon stumbled in a moment later, shielding a flickering oil lantern beneath his coat. The yellow light threw frantic, monstrous shadows against the walls. He leveled the rifle, looking for a predator. "Ain't no cat," Hattie said, breathless. She was still holding the bay down, gently stroking its neck, her voice dropping to a soothing murmur. "The wind blew a piece of tin roofing off your shed. It's banging against the back wall. Sounds like gunfire to them." Gideon stood frozen, holding the lantern. He watched his wife. Her coat was torn. Her hair was a wild, wet mess plastered to her face. She was breathing heavily, her massive chest rising and falling against the side of the half-ton animal she had just wrestled into submission. He had seen men try to muscle a panicked horse. They usually ended up with broken ribs or trampled to death. Hattie hadn't just used muscle. She had used her mass, her presence, and an instinctive, fearless understanding of the beast. She looked up at him, her pale eyes catching the lantern light. "Go fix that tin, Gideon, before he kicks this wall down." Gideon didn't argue. He didn't issue an order. For the first time in 10 years, he felt something entirely unfamiliar blooming in his chest. It wasn't love, not yet. It was profound, absolute respect. He nodded, stepped out into the blinding white, and went to fix the roof. The blizzard blew for 3 days, burying the cabin up to the bottom of the windows. When it finally broke, it left behind a world of blinding, crystalline silence. The temperature dropped so low that the moisture in Hattie's breath froze in her nose the second she stepped out to hack a path to the woodpile. Survival in the deep winter wasn't an adventure. It was a grueling, monotonous chore. They settled into a claustrophobic routine. The cabin, which had seemed suitably large on that first day, shrank. With the shutters barred against the drafts and the fire blazing constantly, The room smelled intensely of the two of them. It smelled of Gideon's pipe tobacco, the rancid tang of the beaver casters he used for bait, and the sour yeast of a Hattie's sourdough starter. They moved around each other like two heavy draft animals in a single narrow stall, careful not to bump shoulders. Gideon had insisted Hattie take the rope bed in the corner. He slept on a pallet of bear hides near the hearth. At night, the silence was agonizingly loud. Hattie would lie awake listening to the logs settling in the fire, feeling the heavy draft slipping through the mud chinking. She was hyper-aware of the thick mattress of goose down beneath her and the hard floor Gideon occupied. She knew she took up too much space. Even here at the edge of the world, she felt the burdensome reality of her own flesh. She compensated by working herself to the bone. She baked dense, sour loaves of bread in the Dutch oven. She mended Gideon's woolen long johns, her thick fingers surprisingly deft with a bone needle. Twice a day she waded through the trench to the lean-to, mucking the stalls, breaking the ice in the water troughs with a sledgehammer, and rationing the sweet feed. The animals were her refuge. The horses didn't judge the way her thighs chafed against the heavy wool of her skirt. Gideon watched her. He didn't mean to stare, but the cabin offered nothing else to look at. He was used to the winter making him feral. Usually by December he stopped speaking aloud. He stopped washing. He became a ghost in his own home. Hattie anchored him to humanity. One late afternoon in December, Gideon sat at the rough-hewn table, a fleshing knife in his hand, scraping the fat from a marten pelt. The slick, wet sound of the blade on hide was the only noise in the room. Hattie stood by the fire, her back to him, stirring a pot of venison stew. The heat near the hearth was oppressive. Hattie had unbuttoned the top of her heavy woolen dress and pushed the sleeves past her elbows. Sweat plastered her mousy hair to her thick neck. Gideon paused his scraping. He looked at her forearms. They were roped with muscle, the skin red and mottled from the heat of the fire and the cold of the stable. He watched the way her broad shoulders moved as she worked the heavy wooden spoon through the thick stew. There was a heavy, undeniable solidity to her. His first wife had been a hummingbird, vibrating with nervous energy, until the cold had simply snapped her hollow bones. Hattie was a badger. She was rooted. "You're burning it." Gideon said, his voice a low rasp. He hadn't spoken in 2 days. Hattie stiffened. She didn't turn around. She just scraped the bottom of the iron pot harder. "I ain't burning it. The onions need to caramelize on the iron or the broth tastes like dishwater." "Smells like charcoal." "Then don't eat it." Gideon wiped the blade of his knife on a rag. He stood up the chair legs, scraping harshly against the floorboards. He walked over to the hearth, standing beside her. He was taller, but not by much. He reached past her broad shoulder, dipping a tin spoon into the bubbling brown liquid. He blew on it, then tasted it. The broth was rich, thick with bone marrow, stinging with coarse black pepper and the earthy sweetness of the onions. It was the best thing he had tasted in a decade. "Needs salt," he lied, tossing the spoon into the wash basin. Hattie finally looked at him. Her face was flushed from the fire, her pale blue eyes narrowed in annoyance. "There's salt on the table. Add it yourself." She turned fully toward him, wiping her hands on her heavy canvas apron. They were standing inches apart. Gideon smelled the wood smoke in her hair, the sharp scent of sweat, and the underlying warm smell of rising dough. For a second his eyes dropped to the open collar of her dress, to the heavy swell of her pale collarbone. He stepped back quickly, a sudden unfamiliar heat rising in his own neck. He retreated to his pelt, picking up the fleshing knife with jerky, unnatural movements. "Stew's fine," he muttered. Hattie watched him, a complicated knot tightening in her chest. She had seen the way his eyes dropped, not with the cruel, mocking disgust of the men in Red Bluff, but with a sudden startled awareness. She turned back to the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the spoon. January brought a cold so profound it felt like a physical assault. The timber wolves moved closer to the cabin, driven by starvation, their howls echoing off the granite walls of the valley like breaking glass. Gideon had a trap line set along the frozen creek bed, a 5-mile loop he checked twice a week. It was dangerous work in the deep freeze. A snapped ankle out there meant a slow, freezing death. He left on a Thursday morning, the sky the color of dirty iron. "Leave the grey mule," Hattie had told him, handing him a bundle of hardtack and frozen jerky. "The crust on the snow is too sharp. It'll cut his fetlocks to ribbons." "I need him to pack out," Gideon argued, tightening his snowshoes. "You pack out what you can carry. If you take that mule, I'll be doctoring his legs for a month. Leave him." Gideon had glared at her, but he left the mule. By nightfall, the wind picked up, howling down the chimney and making the flames in the hearth dance violently. Gideon wasn't back. Hattie sat at the table, her mending abandoned. The old tin clock on the mantel ticked off the seconds. 7 o'clock. 8. 9. Mountain men didn't get lost. They didn't take shelter unless they were forced to. If Gideon wasn't back by dark, he was in the ground. At 10 o'clock, Hattie stood up. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for thin women who had men to rescue them. She went to her trunk and pulled out her heaviest woolen union suit, forcing her thick legs and arms into the restricting fabric. She layered 2 flannel shirts over it, followed by a heavy canvas coat lined with sheepskin. She took Gideon's spare rifle from the pegs, checked the action, and shoved a box of cartridges into her deep pocket. She took a coil of heavy hemp rope, a lantern, and a bottle of raw grain alcohol from the bottom shelf of the pantry. She waded out to the lean-to. The grey mule snorted as she approached in the dark. "Sorry, old man." She whispered, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She threw a heavy pack saddle on him, strapping it tight. "We gotta go to work." The cold hit her lungs like swallowed razor blades as she left the perimeter of the cabin. The moon was a sliver, casting a dim, skeletal light over the snow-drowned valley. She knew the general direction of his line, following the creek bed toward the box canyon. She walked ahead of the mule-breaking trail. The snow was mid-thigh deep in places. Every step was a brutal, muscular effort. Her heavy thighs burned, and sweat instantly turned to a freezing slickness against her skin beneath the layers. She kept her head down, leaning her immense weight forward, acting as a human snowplow. She found him 3 miles out. The lantern light caught a smear of black on the pristine white crust. Blood. Gideon was sitting against the trunk of a massive dead lodgepole pine. His snowshoes were off. His right leg was stretched out at a sickening, unnatural angle. A deadfall, a heavy, rotting branch the size of a man's torso lay in the snow beside him. It had snapped under the weight of the snow and fallen on him. His head was slumped forward. His buckskin coat was dark with frozen blood, where a sharp spur of the branch had torn through his shoulder. Hattie dropped the mule's lead rope and plunged through the snow, falling to her knees beside him. "Gideon!" she rasped, pulling her heavy mitten off with her teeth. She slapped his face. His skin was grey-cold as riverstone. "Gideon, wake up!" His eyelids fluttered. His lips were blue, crusted with frozen spit. He looked at her, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Hattie," he slurred. His teeth were chattering so violently he could barely form the word. "Cold. I know, I got you." She didn't waste time looking at the leg. She knew by the angle the bone was broken, likely shattered. If she tried to set it here, he would die of shock. She had to get him off the ice. She unspooled the hemp rope. She tied a crude harness around Gideon's chest under his arms, mindful of the bleeding shoulder. She took the other end and fashioned a loop, throwing it over the horn of the mule's pack saddle. "You're going to scream!" Hattie told him, her voice hard, entirely devoid of pity. Pity wouldn't save him. "But if you pass out, you'll freeze. Stay awake." She went to the mule. She didn't lead him. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the animal. She grabbed the rope where it met the saddle horn, wrapping it twice around her thick gloved hand. "Walk," she commanded the mule. The mule surged forward. The rope snapped taut. Gideon screamed. It was a raw animal sound of pure agony as his broken leg dragged through the deep snow. Hattie shut her eyes against the sound. She leaned forward, using her massive body weight to help the mule pull the dead weight of the man. Her boots slipped, biting into the icy crust. Her shoulders screamed in protest. "Come on!" She roared at the mule at the mountain at the crushing, indifferent cold. "Pull!" It took them 3 hours to cover the 3 miles. Hattie didn't stop. She couldn't. If the mule stopped, if she stopped providing the momentum with her own raw mass, they would all freeze. She tasted blood in the back of her throat. Her muscles trembled so violently she felt she might shake apart. When they finally reached the cabin, Hattie untied the mule and left it in the lean-to, fully saddled. She dragged Gideon the last 20 yards across the porch by the scruff of his coat. She kicked the heavy door open. The fire had died down to embers, but the residual heat hit her face like a physical wall. She dragged him inside, kicking the door shut behind them. She collapsed onto the floorboards beside him, her chest heaving, sucking in the warm, stale air. Gideon was unconscious. He was dying. The cold had seeped into his core, slowing his blood to slush. Hattie forced herself up. Her legs felt like lead pillars. She threw 3 heavy logs onto the embers and furiously worked the bellows until a roaring fire leaped into the chimney. She knelt beside Gideon. His clothes were frozen stiff, welded to his skin by sweat and blood. She didn't try to undress him. She pulled the heavy hunting knife from her belt and began cutting the buckskin and wool away, slicing down the seams until she could peel the stiff, ruined garments off his body. He was entirely naked on the floorboards. He was a landscape of scars, pale lines from bare claws, a jagged burn on his thigh, the puckered star of an old bullet hole. He was lean, stringy muscle and tendon, shivering so violently his heels drummed against the floor. His right leg below the knee was swollen to the size of a melon mottled black and purple. The bone hadn't broken the skin, but it was badly fractured. The wound on his shoulder was worse. A jagged tear 4 inches long, sluggishly oozing dark blood. Hattie grabbed the bottle of grain alcohol. She poured a quarter of it directly onto the shoulder wound. Gideon jolted a ragged gasp, tearing from his throat. His eyes flew open, wild and panicked. He thrashed his hand instinctively, flying up to strike whatever was hurting him. Hattie caught his wrist. She pinned his arm to the floor with one thick hand, using her entire body weight to hold him down. "Hold still!" She shouted, her face inches from his. "You're safe. You're in the cabin. Hold still." He blinked, the panic slowly receding, replaced by a glazed haze of pain. He looked at her. Her hair was down, hanging in wet, tangled ropes around her face. She looked terrifying. She looked like an angel. "Leg," he ground out. "I know. Leg's broke. Shoulder's torn. I gotta sew the shoulder." She moved to the table, her hands shaking, as she threaded a heavy, curved leather needle with boiled horsehair. It was what she used to stitch up torn saddles. It was all she had. She knelt back beside him. "Drink," she ordered, lifting his head and pressing the bottle of alcohol to his lips. He swallowed, gagging as the liquid fire hit his throat. "This is gonna hurt like hell," she said softly. "Do it," he whispered, closing his eyes. She was not gentle. Gentleness took too long. She pinched the torn edges of his flesh together with thick, bloody fingers and drove the curved needle through the meat. Gideon bit down on his lip so hard it bled. He didn't scream again. He just hissed through his teeth with every pull of the heavy thread. Hattie worked mechanically, relying on muscle memory. She had stitched up wire-cut horses by lantern light. Flesh was flesh. When she tied off the last knot, she slumped back on her heels. The bleeding had stopped, but his shivering hadn't. His skin was still the color of skim milk. The fire wasn't enough. The cold was inside him. She grabbed her thick wool blankets from the rope bed and piled them over him. It wasn't enough. He was shaking so hard his teeth were clicking together. Hypothermia. She knew what it looked like. A horse wouldn't survive it without a heated barn. A man wouldn't survive it alone. Hattie looked at the fire. She looked at the shivering, broken man on the floor. She stood up. With stiff, exhausted fingers, she began unbuttoning her heavy canvas coat. She let it drop to the floor. She unbuttoned her flannel shirts, pulling them over her head. She unlaced the heavy boots and stepped out of her wool skirt. She stood in the warm light of the fire, in nothing but her thin cotton chemise and bloomers. She looked down at herself. The heavy swell of her stomach, the thick dimpled flesh of her thighs, the massive breadth of her chest. For 28 years her body had been a source of profound, isolating shame. It was a joke to the town. It was a burden to her. Right now it was a furnace. She lifted the edge of the heavy wool blankets and slid underneath them, lying down on the hard floor beside Gideon. He flinched as she touched him. He was ice. She was fire. Hattie didn't hesitate. She wrapped her thick arms around his chest, pulling his lean, battered body tightly against her own. She draped her heavy thigh over his good leg, trapping him in a cocoon of her own mass. She buried her face in the crook of his uninjured neck, her breath warm against his frozen skin. "Hattie," he mumbled, delirious, trying feebly to pull away from the unfamiliar pressure. "Hush!" she commanded, her voice vibrating against his chest. "Stop fighting. Take the heat." She held him. For the first hour he shook violently against her, his cold seeping into her skin, making her ache. But she didn't let go. She pressed closer, sharing the vast, slow-burning furnace of her own body. Slowly, agonizingly, the shivering began to subside. Gideon's breathing deepened. The rigid tension in his muscles melted. In the dark beneath the heavy wool, he realized what she was doing. He felt the sheer, overwhelming softness of her, the undeniable strength of the arms holding him. She wasn't just a partner anymore. She was the wall standing between him and the dark. He didn't pull away. With a heavy, exhausted sigh, Gideon turned his face into the damp, frizzy hair at her shoulder. He brought his good arm up, resting his rough, calloused hand against the wide, soft curve of her waist. He held on to her and let the mountain howl outside. Morning arrived not with light, but with a slow, grey thinning of the darkness. Hattie woke to the smell of stale sweat, dried blood, and the bitter tang of old ashes. The fire had burned down to a white-hot pile of dust. She was stiff. Every muscle in her back and shoulders ached from the brutal exertion of the night before, and her skin was slick with a shared, feverish sweat. She opened her eyes. She was still wrapped tightly around Gideon on the hard floorboards. He was awake. His breathing was shallow and reedy, whistling slightly through his nose. His dark eyes were fixed on the rough timber ceiling. He didn't move. He didn't try to pull away from the heavy, suffocating warmth of her body pinning him down. "You're alive," Hattie croaked. Her throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. "Legs broke," Gideon whispered. His voice was a dry husk. "I know." Hattie peeled herself away from him. The sudden absence of her body heat made the freezing air of the cabin rush in, biting at her damp skin. She shivered violently, grabbing her clothes from the floor and dragging them over her head. She didn't care about modesty. Modesty belonged to women in town parlors, not women kneeling in frozen blood. She stoked the fire, throwing on pitch-heavy pine chunks that caught immediately, spitting sap. Then she walked over to Gideon. His right leg was a horror. The swelling had turned the flesh tight and shiny, a canvas of deep, sickening purple. The break was mid-calf, the shin bone jutting up at a severe, unnatural angle beneath the skin. "It needs setting," Hattie said. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the leg, assessing it the way she would a wire-cut horse. "I can't pull it," Gideon said. "No leverage. I'll pull it." Gideon finally looked at her. His face was drawn, deeply lined with exhaustion and pain. "It takes a lot of force, Hattie. The muscles are contracted around the break. You got to pull the leg straight, then push the bone down. If you slip, it splinters the marrow." "I know how a fracture works," Hattie said flatly. "I set a foal's leg 2 springs ago. You ain't a foal, but the mechanics are the same." She didn't wait for his permission. She went to the woodpile and selected 2 straight, flat pieces of split oak. She took the rest of the grain alcohol, a clean linen rag, and her heavy coil of rope. She sat at his feet. She took off her boots. "What are you doing?" Gideon asked, his chest hitching as a spasm of pain rocked his leg. I need traction, Hattie said. She slid down, planting her thick, bare feet firmly against the meat of his upper thighs, bracing herself. She leaned forward, grabbing his ankle with both of her large, calloused hands. Her grip was like a vice. Gideon, she said, her voice dropping to that deep, vibrating register she used on terrified animals. Bite down on your coat. He grabbed a fistful of the ruined buckskin he had worn yesterday and shoved it between his teeth. He nodded once. Hattie didn't count to 3. Anticipation made muscles tense. She simply locked her elbows, pressed her feet into his thighs, and threw her entire massive upper body weight backward. Gideon's eyes rolled back in his head. A muffled guttural roar tore through the leather in his mouth. The sound of the leg pulling straight was sickening, a wet, heavy grating of cartilage and bone scraping against bone. Hattie gritted her teeth, ignoring his agony. She pulled harder, her shoulders screaming until she felt the horrible resistance give way. With a final sickening pop, the tibia snapped back into alignment beneath the swollen skin. She immediately released the tension, lunging forward to clamp her hands around the calf, holding the bone in place. It's in. She panted, her face inches from his knee. It's straight. Gideon didn't answer. He had passed out, his head lolled to the side, spit pooling at the corner of his mouth. Hattie worked fast. She bathed the leg in the freezing alcohol, bound it tightly with the linen, and strapped the oak splints to either side, securing them with heavy twine. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on her heavy canvas skirt. She looked at the unconscious man on the floor. For the first time since he walked into the livery in Red Bluff, she didn't see a transaction. She saw a man who had trusted her with his life, knowing full well she was just the fat girl nobody wanted. She picked up his good arm, feeling the steady thumping pulse at his wrist. You're stuck with me now, mountain man, she whispered to the empty room. February crept into March with agonizing slowness. The snow stopped falling, but the cold deepened, locking the valley in a pristine, impenetrable cage of ice. The dynamic in the cabin shifted completely and irreversibly. Gideon was confined to the rope bed. The fever from the torn shoulder had burned off after a terrifying 3 days, but the leg kept him immobile. A mountain man who couldn't walk was a dead man. He knew it, and he knew that the only reason he was breathing was the heavy-set woman currently hacking at a frozen side of venison on the table. Hattie became the master of the homestead. She chopped the wood, her heavy axe swings echoing off the granite cliffs. She checked his close-in snares, bringing back scrawny snowshoe hairs that she boiled down into thick, gelatinous stews. She waded to the lean-to twice a day, talking to the mules in a low, rumbling voice that Gideon could hear through the log walls. He watched her. It was all he could do. He watched the way the firelight caught the frizzy strands of her brown hair. He watched the sheer, undeniable power in her thick forearms as she kneaded dough. He saw the way she favored her left knee when the cold was particularly bitter, a silent testament to the toll the labor was taking on her joints. She didn't complain. Not once. But she didn't soften either. She was a woman built for endurance, not comfort. You're chopping the kindling too thick, Gideon rasped one afternoon. He was sitting up in bed, whittling a piece of soft pine with his hunting knife, just to keep his hands busy. Hattie dropped an armful of wood into the bin next to the hearth with a heavy clatter. She wiped a line of sweat from her broad forehead with the back of her wrist. It burns fine, she said curtly. It smoulders, makes the chimney smoke. Then get up and chop it yourself. Gideon fell silent. The knife paused on the wood. It wasn't a malicious retort. It was a pure, unfiltered statement of fact. He couldn't. He was entirely at her mercy. Hattie sighed, instantly regretting the sharpness of her tongue. She walked over to the wash basin, dipping a rag into the freezing water and pressing it to her neck. I'm sorry, she muttered. The grey mule threw a shoe. I spent an hour trying to tack it back on in the dark. I'm tired. Gideon looked at her back. The heavy wool of her dress strained across her broad shoulders. You don't have to apologize to me, Hattie. You're doing the work of 2 men. Hattie turned around, her pale eyes narrowing. I ain't doing it for praise, Gideon. You bought a partner. You paid $50 for a workhorse. I'm just fulfilling the contract. Her words hit him like a physical blow. The cynical, transactional nature of their arrangement, the very thing he had proposed, now tasted like ash in his mouth. Is that all this is to you? Gideon asked quietly. Hattie stiffened. She looked away, staring into the flickering flames of the hearth. What else would it be? I ain't stupid, Gideon. I know what I look like. I know why you picked me. You needed someone who wouldn't break someone, who wouldn't expect a romantic, soft life. You got what you paid for. I picked you because of the way you handled that roan in the livery. Gideon corrected, his voice hardening. I picked you because you were the only person in that town who looked me in the eye instead of staring at the floor. And because I'm big enough to pull a plough if the mules die? Hattie snapped, crossing her thick arms defensively across her chest. Gideon didn't argue. He carefully set his knife down on the side table. He reached over, pulling the heavy wool blanket off his ruined leg. Come here, he said. Hattie didn't move. I got stew to stir. Hattie, come here. It wasn't an order. It was a request laced with a vulnerability she had never heard from him. She walked over slowly, standing at the foot of the bed. She looked enormous in the small space, a physical barrier between him and the rest of the world. Gideon reached out. His calloused, scarred hand grasped her thick wrist. He didn't pull her down. He just held her arm. When the deadfall hit me, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low rumble, I lay there in the snow, and I thought about the cold. I thought about how it was going to stop my heart. But mostly I thought about the fact that I was going to leave you up here alone. He ran his thumb over the pulse point on her wrist. Her skin was rough, chapped from the wind, smelling of pine pitch and horse sweat. I didn't buy a workhorse, Hattie. I bought a chance to survive. But you dragging me through 3 miles of deep snow, that wasn't in the contract. Laying naked on a freezing floor to keep my blood moving, that wasn't in the contract. Hattie's throat tightened. A hard, painful lump formed behind her sternum. She tried to pull her hand away, terrified of the crack forming in her iron-clad cynicism. If she believed him, if she let herself feel something other than duty, the inevitable disappointment would destroy her. Gideon didn't let go. He held her wrist firmly. You ain't just a partner anymore, he said, looking up into her pale, wide eyes. You're the only thing keeping the dark out of this cabin. He released her hand, leaning back against the log wall. Hattie stood frozen for a long moment, the ghost of his touch burning on her skin. She didn't say anything. She turned sharply and went back to the fire, stirring the stew so aggressively the broth splashed onto the iron hearth. But that night, when she lay on her pallet on the floor, she didn't turn her back to the bed. She lay facing him in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, entirely terrified of the spring. The mountain didn't surrender to spring. It fought it violently. April brought torrential rains that turned the snowpack into a treacherous, sliding mush. The creek swelled, roaring with a deafening fury, and the smell of wet earth, rotting pine needles, and thawing mud permeated the cabin. Gideon was out of bed. He had whittled a heavy crutch out of a hickory branch and padded the armpit with a scrap of sheepskin. He hobbled around the cabin, useless and frustrated, watching Hattie prepare for the descent. The contract was clear. Winter was over. The pelts were cured and bundled. Hattie was in the lean-to, brushing the heavy winter coat off the grey mule. The air was thick with flying hair and the smell of ammonia. She worked methodically, her heavy hands moving with practiced grace over the animal's flanks. Gideon stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on his crutch. The mud sucked at the tip of the wood. You're packing them tight, he observed. The trail is washed out in 3 places. Hattie replied, not turning around. If the loads shift on the scree, they'll go over the edge. Have to balance the beaver pelts against the traps. She grabbed a heavy canvas sack and hefted it onto the pack saddle, securing it with a diamond hitch. She threw her weight into the rope, pulling it taut with a grunt of effort. I counted the bundles. Hattie said, her voice meticulously neutral. 60 pelts. Half is 30. If prices are what they were last fall, that's almost $200. Gideon's jaw tightened. You calculating your buyout? Hattie stopped brushing the mule. She rested her thick forearms on the animal's back and finally looked at him. The winter had leaned him out, carving deep hollows under his cheekbones, but his eyes were sharp. A deal's a deal, Hattie said. Her voice lacked its usual gravelly bite. It just sounded tired. You need the mules to pack the furs down to Red Bluff. Once they're sold, I take my half. You keep the animals. You can hire a boy from town to help you next winter. Someone who don't eat so much. She tried for a self-deprecating smile, but it failed, twisting her mouth into a bitter line. Gideon didn't laugh. He hobbled into the lean-to, the crutch sinking into the damp, straw-covered earth. He stopped 2 feet away from her. I ain't hiring a boy, he said. You can't manage the trap lines and the horses on that leg. It'll be a year before you walk right. I know. Gideon dropped the crutch. It hit the dirt with a soft thud. He swayed heavily, throwing his left arm out. He caught himself by grabbing Hattie's broad shoulder. His fingers dug into the heavy wool of her coat. Hattie gasped, instinctuating, reaching up to steady him, her thick hands grabbing his waist. He was heavy, his entire weight suddenly relying on her to keep him upright. Gideon, you fool, what are you doing? She snapped, holding him tight. He looked down at her. They were standing chest to chest, the panicked heat of her body radiating against him. I'm leaning on you, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, because I can't stand on my own, and I don't want to. Hattie stared at him, her pale eyes wide, searching his weathered face for the lie for the joke. She had spent 28 years bracing for the punchline. Don't do this, she whispered, her chin trembling. Don't pretend you want me here when the snow melts. I know what I am. I'm a heavy, ugly thing that kept you from freezing. You don't have to be polite. Hattie. Gideon interrupted, his hand moving from her shoulder to cup her face. His calloused thumb brushed against her cheekbone. Look at me. She forced herself to meet his eyes. You think I care about the town. You think I care about what the lowlanders think is pretty. Gideon's thumb dragged across her jawline. I lived in the dark for 10 years. You broke my leg straight with your bare hands. You dragged me through 3 miles of ice. You took up all the space in that cabin, and for the first time in my life, it felt like a home. He leaned in his face inches from hers. He smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and rain. You ain't going down that mountain, Hattie, he said, not as an order, but as an absolute, undeniable truth. Because I'm not letting my wife go. Hattie's breath hitched. The iron cage she had built around her heart, forged in years of mockery and isolation, suddenly cracked wide open. She didn't cry gracefully. She let out a harsh, jagged sob, her thick arms wrapping around his waist, pulling his lean body flush against hers. She buried her face in his neck, clutching the back of his buckskin coat like a drowning woman. Gideon held her. He wrapped his arms around her broad back, burying his face in her frizzy, dusty hair. He closed his eyes, feeling the sheer, unmovable solidity of the woman in his arms. Outside, the spring rain washed the mud from the high trail. They didn't hear it. They stood in the warm, dark stable, surrounded by the quiet breathing of the animals, perfectly anchored to the earth. That concludes the rugged, unforgettable journey of Hattie and Gideon. What started as a cold, transactional bargain for survival blossomed into a deep, unshakable partnership built on raw strength and mutual respect. Hattie proved that true worth isn't found in a mirror, but in the grit it takes to weather the deadliest storms. If you loved this deeply human Western tale, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with fellow story lovers. We want to hear from you. What was your favorite moment in the cabin? Drop a comment below, and we'll see you in the next story.